Next thing we're going to do is take a look at what we call quadratic expressions. And I want to give a call out. Remember, for those of you bilingual folks, first, freaking awesome. I started speaking Spanish when I was like 11, and I'm so jealous of those of you that grew up speaking Spanish. God, what a gift. In Spanish, I'm going to call this cuadro. Cuadro is another way to say square. Stupid English spells everything wrong because we can't make it easy on the people that like to write. Quadratic means square. Well, what does square mean in mathematical terms? Well, we drop a variable in the base. We drop a second power in the exponent. Quadratic expressions involve squares. When we define this, we're going to say a quadratic expression can be put in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. This form right here is super famous. In fact, nerdy mathematicians like to say, this is the standard form of a quadratic expression, so that they can make themselves sound smart. In other words, all quadratic expressions can be put into this form, and we can tell this is quadratic because there's that square. Notice if we were to delete the square, it actually is linear. In this case, we're using different letters, but mx plus c or b, that's not quadratic because there's no square term. The moment we drop that square in, we see that's quadratic. Cuadro means square. Let's take a look at some examples of quadratic expressions. And we're going to start with the most beautiful, which is just x squared. This is a quadratic expression because it has a variable in the base, a square power. Notice if we were to think about that standard form, we'll go ahead and write it on the top, ax squared plus bx plus c. Here's a claim. Here, the a, the number in front of the x squared, is going to be 1, since 1 times x squared is indeed x squared. The b is going to be 0, because 0 times x is 0. And the c is also going to be 0. In other words, this thing right here we're going to call a pure square power. And even pure square powered can be put into standard form. Let's take a look at another example of a quadratic expression. Perhaps we have something like 3x squared plus 6x plus 2. Here we call this a quadratic expression because it involves the square. We say that it's an expression because if we look at the entire statement with all these crazy symbols right there, there's no equal sign. When there's no equal sign, we call that expression. If I wanted to be super clear on this, we see the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c, and we can actually kill a fly with a hammer. A would be 3, b would be 6, c would be 2 in that case. Let's take a look at one that doesn't look like a quadratic expression to begin with, but actually is a quadratic expression hidden underneath. Perhaps we have something like x minus 4 squared. Well, first and foremost, I should be very, very careful before I actually do equivalent expressions. This thing is an expression because as written, there's no equal sign. We see that we have a second power, or what we might call a square power. In this class, every time we see a square, what am I going to encourage you to remember? Squares are quadratics. This is actually what we call a pure second power. And another way to say this is a perfect square. There are no squares better than this one. And we'll come back to this later in the course. Don't trip, you know. Remember that squares count multiplication. So count the number of times the base shows up. In this case, this base is going to show up twice. And then we had this really, really famous rule, I think we call it saran wrap or foil or some shit like that, where we say, okay, let's go ahead and distribute like this. So we said first, outer, inner, last. And in this case, we had something like x squared minus 4x plus 16. And we could write that whole thing as x squared minus 8x plus 16. Whoa, lo and behold, this thing is indeed in our standard form. Here the a would be 1, the b is going to be -8, the c is going to be 16. Each of these 1, 2, 3 are quadratic expressions because the square shows up, and they can all be massaged and manipulated to be in this form.